As the final days of 1971 slipped away, the American military presence in South Vietnam had dwindled to a fraction of what it had been just 2 years earlier. On the last day of December, roughly 156,000 United States personnel remained in country, down from a peak of more than 540,000 in 1969. The vast machinery of war that had once sprawled across the landscape was being dismantled piece by piece, shipped home or handed over to South Vietnamese forces who would now bear the weight of their own defense. By late 1971, virtually all American ground combat capability had been withdrawn. What remained were mostly advisors, logistics units, artillery batteries, and aviation squadrons. In the Central Highlands, only small Special Forces detachments and elements of the 3rd Brigade, 4th Infantry Division still operated, their mission now focused on training South Vietnamese troops and conducting harassment operations against enemy base areas. The great American infantry divisions that had once swept through the jungles and rice paddies were gone, their colors cased and sent home. Planning documents called for further reductions in the coming months. By mid-1972, American troop strength was projected to fall toward 30,000, a residual force that would provide advice and support, but no longer fight the ground war. This was Vietnamization in its final stages, the policy that had dominated American strategy since President Nixon took office. The idea was elegant in its simplicity and terrifying in its implications. South Vietnam would fight its own war with American equipment, American money, and American air power, but without American soldiers dying in its defense. The South Vietnamese armed forces had grown enormously to fill the void. By 1971, the Republic of Vietnam Armed Forces numbered roughly 1,046,000 personnel across all branches. The Army of the Republic of Vietnam comprised 11 infantry divisions, plus airborne brigades, Marine units, Ranger battalions, and armored formations. Hundreds of thousands more served in the regional forces and popular forces, the territorial troops responsible for securing villages and hamlets across the countryside. These men, often poorly paid and inadequately trained, formed the backbone of local security throughout the provinces. American assessments described the South Vietnamese as conducting the bulk of ground combat operations by late 1971. Under Vietnamization, they had assumed primary responsibility for all 4 military regions, from the rice paddies of the Mekong Delta to the mountains along the demilitarized zone. It was their war now, at least on the ground. Yet the enemy had not gone away. Intelligence estimates suggested that North Vietnamese and Viet Cong main force strength in and around South Vietnam remained in the hundreds of thousands despite years of bloody fighting. Communist forces in the Southern Theater included both People's Army of Vietnam divisions that had infiltrated from the north and locally raised Viet Cong units that had been fighting for years. The Ho Chi Minh Trail, that vast logistical network winding through southern Laos and eastern Cambodia, continued to function despite near-constant American air attacks. Supplies flowed south in a seemingly endless stream. The infiltration numbers were staggering. During the 1970 to 1971 dry season, approximately 106,000 personnel had been dispatched from North Vietnam down the trail. Between September 1971 and June 1972, intelligence estimated that another 136,000 infiltrators were sent southward toward South Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. By early April 1972, assessments concluded that the North Vietnamese Army had achieved what analysts called a maximum forward posture, with large numbers of combat forces deployed outside North Vietnam's borders and positioned for offensive operations. American air power remained the primary contribution to South Vietnam's defense in early 1972. Tactical aircraft and B-52 bombers still flew sorties over South Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia, while strategic bombing of North Vietnam itself remained limited under the terms of the 1968 bombing halt. By early 1972, only about 69,000 American troops remained in country, with just 11 maneuver battalions and 3 artillery battalions still deployed. No American fighter squadrons were based in South Vietnam anymore. Tactical air support now flew from Thailand, from aircraft carriers offshore, and from other locations beyond Vietnamese soil. The remaining American armored and air cavalry squadrons had been ordered to redeploy before the end of April 1972. The major American operation of these years was not a combat offensive, but the massive withdrawal of more than 300,000 troops. In the northern provinces of I Corps, American Marine and Army maneuver battalions had been greatly reduced, leaving South Vietnamese divisions and territorial forces to defend the approaches to the demilitarized zone. Defensive planning focused on 3 key regions where intelligence suggested the enemy might strike. In I Corps, the northernmost sector, South Vietnamese 1st Division and Marine units were deployed near Quang Tri and Hue to guard against attacks across the DMZ and from Laos. In II Corps, the Central Highlands, forces around Kontum, Pleiku, and Tan Con were positioned to block enemy routes from Laos through the mountain passes. In III Corps, surrounding Saigon, divisions and armor stood ready to defend approaches from Cambodia toward An Loc and Tay Ninh. Maps still showed secure control over most major cities and main highways, though many rural and border areas were classified as contested. Pacification statistics reported continued increases in the number of hamlets rated secure or relatively secure, But some analysts cautioned that these ratings could fluctuate quickly if South Vietnamese units were redeployed elsewhere or if enemy activity surged. The security situation was fragile, dependent on factors that could shift without warning. American advisors and military commanders generally believed that South Vietnamese forces could handle anticipated communist activity with continued American air and logistics support. Official assessments judged that the Army had improved in equipment and some aspects of performance, though weaknesses in leadership and logistics remained concerns. The billion-dollar question was whether Vietnamization had produced an army capable of standing on its own against a determined enemy. In Saigon, President Nguyen Van Thieu had won an uncontested re-election in October 1971, reinforcing his control over the government after opposition candidates withdrew. American observers noted that the circumstances of his re-election raised questions about democratic legitimacy, but it ensured continuity of leadership at a critical moment. South Vietnamese government messaging emphasized that Vietnamization was succeeding and that their forces could defend against communist attacks. The Nixon administration echoed these assessments, presenting remaining American forces as merely a residual support presence. But American public opinion had turned decisively against the war. Polls in 1971 showed majorities favoring complete withdrawal, with support for continuing large-scale involvement declining steadily. One survey reported that by April 1971, roughly 73% of Americans favored complete troop withdrawal by year's end. Anti-war demonstrations continued, though on a smaller scale than the massive moratorium events of 1969. The political pressure to end American involvement was immense and growing. In Paris, peace talks continued between the 4 parties: the United States, South Vietnam, North Vietnam, and the Provisional Revolutionary Government. Progress remained elusive. Beyond the public sessions, Henry Kissinger and Le Duc Tho had been meeting secretly since 1969, but by late 1971, these talks too had stalled. The fundamental issues remained unresolved. Washington insisted on mutual troop withdrawals and preservation of the Saigon government. Hanoi demanded Thieu's removal and recognition of the revolutionary forces as a legitimate political entity. Intelligence detected ominous signs. Throughout 1971, analysts tracked movement of tanks, heavy artillery, and large numbers of troops along the Ho Chi Minh Trail, suggesting preparation for major operations. North Vietnam had rebuilt many units damaged in earlier campaigns and was building up armor and artillery near the DMZ and in Laos. Tens of thousands of men, hundreds of tanks, and huge stocks of supplies were moving into forward positions. Yet despite these warnings, Allied commanders underestimated what was coming. General assessments suggested the enemy might launch significant attacks, but few predicted the scale and simultaneous multi-front nature of what would soon unfold. North Vietnamese planning documents, as interpreted by American analysts, revealed that Hanoi saw the combination of American withdrawals and domestic political pressure as creating a favorable strategic opportunity. The moment to strike was approaching, and Hanoi's leaders knew it. As 1971 gave way to 1972, the stage was set for the largest communist offensive since Tet 4 years earlier. The storm clouds were gathering, and when they broke, they would test every assumption that Vietnamization had been built upon. The attack came at 9 o'clock in the morning on the 30th of March, 1972. Heavy artillery began falling across the demilitarized zone, raining down on South Vietnamese positions in Quang Tri Province with a fury not seen since the war's darkest days. Long-range Soviet-supplied guns, including the powerful M46 130mm artillery pieces, hurled shells onto outposts and firebases that had grown accustomed to relative quiet. This was no local probe or harassment fire. This was the beginning of something massive. The Easter Offensive, known to the North Vietnamese as the Nguyen Hue Campaign, would prove to be the largest conventional military operation since the Korean War. It struck on three main fronts simultaneously, a coordinated assault designed to overwhelm South Vietnamese defenses and shatter the promise of Vietnamization. In the north, the attack targeted positions along the DMZ and drove into Quang Tri and Thu Thien provinces. In the Central Highlands, forces converged on Kon Tum and the Tan Kandak To complex. In the south, the offensive aimed at Bin Long province and the key town of An Loc, threatening the approaches to Saigon itself. The scale of the attack was staggering. Estimates varied, but most sources agreed that between 120,000 and 200,000 North Vietnamese troops were committed across all fronts, organized into roughly 14 divisions plus multiple independent regiments. Tens of thousands of men, hundreds of tanks, and enormous stocks of supplies had been positioned during months of preparation. This was not guerrilla warfare. This was conventional, combined arms warfare of the type that great armies had waged throughout the 20th century. On the northern front, the B-5 Front commanded forces that included the 304th, 308th, 324B, and later the 320B divisions, along with attached armor and artillery units. At the outset, approximately 30,000 troops with more than 100 tanks attacked across the DMZ into Quang Tri province. Soviet-made T-54 medium tanks and PT-76 light amphibious tanks rolled forward, their presence a stark reminder that this offensive represented a fundamental shift in North Vietnamese tactics. The initial assaults fell upon the newly formed South Vietnamese 3rd Division, whose positions ran along the DMZ and protected the northern approaches to Quang Tri City. Firebases with names like Carroll, My Loc, and the Alpha positions near the DMZ came under intense artillery bombardment and ground attack in the first hours and days. Poor weather and early monsoon conditions on March 30th and 31st severely limited American and South Vietnamese tactical air support, giving the attackers a critical advantage as they pushed forward through the rain and mist. By April 1st, North Vietnamese forces had broken through several defensive positions along the DMZ. South Vietnamese units fell back toward Dong Ha and Quang Tri City, fighting rearguard actions as they withdrew. The situation deteriorated rapidly. Artillery barrages continued almost without pause, and ground attacks probed for weaknesses along the entire line. Dong Ha, a crucial road and bridge hub near the Cuo Viet River, became the focal point of desperate fighting as enemy forces attempted to cross the waterways and cut the South Vietnamese lines of communication. American naval gunfire and B-52 strikes were quickly committed to support the defense, raining destruction on enemy formations massing north of the rivers. Navy aircraft from carriers offshore joined Air Force planes from Thailand in providing tactical air support as weather permitted. But the attackers kept coming, absorbing losses and pressing forward with grim determination. In the Central Highlands, the B-3 Front directed another powerful thrust. The 2nd, 320th, and 3rd Divisions, plus armor and artillery, concentrated against Con Tum and the Tan Can Dak II defensive complex. The objective was nothing less than cutting South Vietnam in two, severing the narrow waist of the country and isolating the northern provinces from Saigon. South Vietnamese forces in the Ia Corps included the 22nd Division at Tan Can Dak II and the 23rd Division around Con Tum City. Beginning around April 4th, heavy artillery and rocket attacks struck fire bases along Rocket Ridge, the high ground northwest of Con Tum. Armor and infantry then attacked South Vietnamese positions, aiming to break the northern defense line and open the road to the provincial capital. Brigadier General Ly Tong Ba of the 23rd Division deployed armored reserve task forces to counterattack around Con Tum as the pressure intensified. On the southern front, the assault aimed at capturing and lock and opening a direct ground route to Saigon. The attacking force included the 5th, 7th, and 9th Divisions, supported by the 75th Artillery Division and 3 tank battalions. Approximately 18,000 troops from these formations were committed against En Loc itself, while additional units established blocking positions along Highway 13 to prevent relief forces from reaching the besieged town. In early April, North Vietnamese forces crossed from Cambodian base areas into Binh Long province, quickly seizing Loc Ninh, a district town near the border. This provided a forward base for the drive on An Loc, the provincial capital that lay about 60 to 70 miles north of Saigon on Highway 13. Both sides understood its strategic importance. If An Loc fell, nothing stood between the enemy and the outskirts of the capital except open road. The Easter Offensive marked a fundamental transformation in how Hanoi waged the war. Gone was the emphasis on guerrilla tactics and political agitation that had characterized earlier phases of the conflict. This was a conventional combined arms assault combining large-scale infantry attacks with armor, heavy artillery, and sophisticated anti-aircraft defenses. It resembled the kind of warfare waged by major industrial powers, not the insurgency that American strategists had spent years trying to counter. South Vietnamese forces on all three fronts were initially surprised by the scale and simultaneity of the attacks, despite prior intelligence about enemy buildups. In the first week of April, the 3rd Division in I Corps executed tactical withdrawals from forward positions toward more defensible lines closer to Quang Tri City. South Vietnamese Marine brigades and armored units rushed north to reinforce the defense of Dong Ha and the critical Cuo Viet Bridge area. American tactical air support increased rapidly over I Corps as weather improved during April. Navy aircraft from carriers offshore, Marine Air, and Air Force planes from Thailand all joined the fight. B-52 arc light strikes hammered enemy armor and troop concentrations along the DMZ and in northern Quang Tri province. The bombers flew mission after mission, their massive payloads tearing apart formations that had no defense against attacks from 30,000 feet. In the Central Highlands during April, South Vietnamese forces held Contum City itself despite mounting pressure, but outlying fire bases and northern positions came under increasing threat. Enemy operations cut or threatened Route 14, the main north-south road through Tu Corps, complicating supply and reinforcement efforts. On the southern front, after capturing Loc Ninh, enemy forces moved toward An Loc, while South Vietnamese units attempted to block advances along Highway 13. The encirclement of the provincial capital tightened as April progressed, and Loc, now cut off from ground resupply, prepared for a siege that would test the limits of defensive warfare and American air power. By mid-April, American analysts estimated that at least 8 division equivalents had been committed across the 3 fronts, with further reserves available. The intensity of the offensive led President Nixon to authorize expanded American air operations, including strikes against North Vietnam itself, that would soon receive their own designation. Early enemy advances had resulted in the overrunning of several South Vietnamese fire bases near the DMZ and in the Central Highlands, along with the loss of territory in northern Quang Tri and border regions. Contemporary assessments describe the situation in I Corps as critical. The combination of enemy armor, heavy artillery, and weather-limited air support had created conditions that many feared could lead to collapse. Yet South Vietnamese units, especially the Marines and Airborne, conducted counterattacks supported by concentrated American air power. They bent, but did not break. Major battles raged simultaneously on 3 fronts throughout April, testing whether the South Vietnamese could operate effectively without large American ground combat forces beside them. The question that had haunted Vietnamization from its inception was now being answered in blood and fire across the length and breadth of South Vietnam. By the end of April, the enemy had made significant gains in northern Quang Tri province and along some border areas, seizing territory that had been under Saigon's control for years. But South Vietnamese forces still held key centers including Hue, Contum, and An Loc. The offensive had achieved tactical success in several areas, but strategic victory remained elusive. The battles that would determine the war's ultimate trajectory were only beginning. The battle for An Loc would become one of the defining sieges of the Vietnam War, a brutal contest that stretched from mid-April through late July of 1972. The town itself was modest in size, the capital of Binh Long province, sitting at the intersection of roads that led through the rubber plantation country toward Cambodia and beyond. Its location on Highway 13, roughly 60 to 70 miles north of Saigon, gave it strategic importance, far beyond its physical dimensions. Whoever controlled An Loc controlled the main road to the capital, the arterial route that connected the northern provinces to the heart of South Vietnam. North Vietnamese planners viewed it not only as a military objective, but as a potential seat for a provisional revolutionary government, a political symbol that would demonstrate the weakness of the Saigon regime and provide a platform for diplomatic recognition. The assault on Binh Long province was assigned to the B-2 front, which committed 3 full divisions to the operation. The 5th, 7th, and 9th divisions, along with independent regiments, armor, artillery, and anti-aircraft units, converged on the area. Over 36,000 troops were eventually committed against An Loc and its approaches, vastly outnumbering the defenders who would have to hold the town against wave after wave of attacks. South Vietnamese forces initially responsible for the province included the 5th ARVN Division, regional and popular forces, rangers, and local militia. On April 5th, the offensive began in earnest when enemy forces attacked Loc Ninh, a district town near the Cambodian border. The garrison there, primarily elements of the 9th Regiment of the 5th Division, along with local forces, numbered about 2,000 troops. After intense fighting, Loc Ninh fell, providing the attackers with a forward base for the drive on An Loc. With Loc Ninh secured, the 9th Division seized the nearby airstrip at Quan Loi, about 2 miles northeast of An Loc, eliminating the possibility of reinforcement or resupply by fixed-wing aircraft. The noose was tightening. South of the town, elements of the 7th Division established blocking positions along Highway 13, cutting off the garrison from potential relief forces moving north from Saigon. The 1st Airborne Brigade was redeployed from the Saigon area and ordered to move up Highway 13 to reinforce an A lock, but the blocking positions made progress painfully slow and costly. By the afternoon of April 12th, South Vietnamese forces in and immediately around An Loc consisted of 9 infantry battalions, including elements of the 5th and 18th Divisions, Rangers, and local forces. General Le Van Hung, commander of the 5th Division, was given operational control of all units inside the perimeter. Estimates suggest that between 3,500 and 5,000 troops would defend An Loc against forces that outnumbered them 10-1. At dawn on April 13th, the main assault began. A thunderous artillery bombardment shook the town as shells crashed into defensive positions, buildings, and streets. Then came a coordinated tank infantry attack from the northeast. Soviet-supplied T-54 and PT-76 tanks rolled into An Loc along the main north-south streets, their engines roaring and guns blazing, their crews expecting to crush the defense quickly. But the defenders fought back with everything they had. Anti-tank weapons, artillery, and air-directed fires blunted the assault, preventing the attackers from securing full control of the town. Soldiers armed with M72 Law rockets crouched in rubble and took aim at the steel monsters rumbling past. After 3 days of intense fighting, the first attempt to capture An Loc outright had failed. The battle shifted into a prolonged siege that would test every man within the perimeter. The attackers revised their plans. The 9th Division would continue the main assault on the town, while the 5th and 7th Divisions focused on preventing relief efforts along Highway 13. A second major assault began before dawn on April 19th, again preceded by heavy artillery strikes that fell on both An Loc and the 1st Airborne Brigade positions to the south. Enemy forces overran 1 airborne battalion and pushed 2 others back into the city, increasing pressure on the shrinking perimeter. Yet again, the defenders held. By late April, An Loc was effectively encircled. The attackers controlled much of the surrounding countryside and sections of Highway 13. The garrison was completely dependent on aerial resupply, with transport aircraft and helicopters braving intense anti-aircraft fire to drop ammunition, food, and medical supplies. The town had become an island in a sea of hostile forces. American air power proved decisive in keeping An Loc alive. Tactical aircraft, including AC-130 and AC-119 gunships, AH-1 Cobra helicopter gunships, and South Vietnamese A-37 light attack jets, flew frequent close support missions over the beleaguered town. But it was the B-52 Stratofortress bombers, dropping their massive payloads on enemy troop and artillery concentrations around the perimeter, that made the crucial difference. The bombers flew missions at remarkably close range to friendly positions, sometimes within a few kilometers of the defensive lines, pulverizing attacking formations before they could mass for breakthrough attempts. Before the main assaults, South Vietnamese Chinook helicopters had managed to fly at least 42 sorties delivering reinforcements and supplies. As the siege tightened and the Quan Loi airstrip became unusable, fixed-wing aircraft switched to airdrops. The risks were immense. Enemy anti-aircraft defenses increased steadily around the town, including the introduction of Soviet Strela shoulder-fired missiles that raised the danger for low-flying aircraft. On May 11th, the third and most devastating assault began. At 5 in the morning, an intense artillery bombardment opened up, estimated at about 10,000 rounds in 12 hours. Shells screamed down on every corner of the defensive perimeter, collapsing buildings, destroying bunkers, and killing and wounding scores of defenders. The ground attack that followed involved 7 regiments striking from the north and northwest, again supported by tanks. Wave after wave of infantry surged forward through the dust and smoke. The assault created 2 salients in the defensive perimeter and nearly split the defense into separate pockets. For hours, the outcome hung in the balance, with desperate close quarters fighting in the streets and ruins of what had once been a provincial capital. American air power responded with overwhelming force. B-52s flew missions at roughly 55-minute intervals for about 30 hours, raining destruction on enemy concentrations. In that single effort, approximately 170 B-52 sorties were flown in support of Enlock. On May 11th alone, 297 tactical air sorties joined the battle, followed by more than 250 sorties on each of the next 4 days. The combination of concentrated strategic bombing and tactical air support blunted the assault and prevented the town from being overrun. By late May, intelligence estimated enemy casualties at Enlock in the tens of thousands. Multiple attacking regiments had been rendered combat ineffective, their ranks shattered by the relentless air attacks and the stubborn resistance of the defenders. Artillery fire and ground pressure continued throughout May and June, but no further large-scale frontal assaults matching the intensity of April 13th or May 11th were mounted. The attackers had spent their strength against a fortress of rubble and determination. Attempts by relief forces to reopen Highway 13 faced strong blocking positions and progressed slowly. The 21st Division was eventually moved from the Mekong Delta to reinforce the efforts. By early June, segments of the highway had been partially reopened, though the garrison continued to rely heavily on air resupply. On June 18th, President Thieu publicly declared that the siege of Enlock had been broken. Even after that announcement, sporadic fighting and harassment fire continued into July. The Battle of Enlock lasted between 60 and 80 days, depending on how the start and end dates are calculated. Through all those weeks of bombardment and assault, the town never fell to enemy control. South Vietnamese forces retained their positions and prevented a direct ground threat to Saigon via Highway 13. Military analysts concluded that the defense resulted in the virtual destruction of 3 enemy divisions in the area, forces that could not be easily replaced. Every assessment emphasized the same fundamental truth. Without extensive American air power, especially the B-52 and tactical air support that flew thousands of sorties over the besieged town, the small garrison likely could not have held. The failure to capture Enlock denied the attackers a major political and psychological objective of the Easter Offensive. It demonstrated that South Vietnamese units, with sufficient air and logistical support, could withstand large-scale conventional attacks even without American ground combat forces fighting beside them. The lesson was clear, and its implications would shape the remaining years of the war. Air power could substitute for ground forces, at least in static defensive situations where targets were concentrated and clear. But such support required massive resources, political will, and access that might not always be available when the next crisis came. The northern front of the Easter Offensive would produce the longest and fiercest sustained battle of the entire Vietnam War. It began at 9 in the morning on March 30th, 1972, when North Vietnamese artillery opened a devastating barrage across the demilitarized zone onto South Vietnamese outposts in Quang Tri Province. The thunder of Soviet-supplied guns rolled across the landscape like approaching doom, and with it came the realization that everything was about to change. The months of relative quiet were over. The storm had arrived. The attacking force belonged to the B-5 Front and included some of the finest divisions in the North Vietnamese Army. The 304th and 308th Divisions, with approximately 30,000 troops, led the initial assault, supported by more than 100 tanks. Attached armor and artillery units added to the weight of the attack. Later, the 320B and 324B divisions would join the battle, feeding fresh strength into the offensive as earlier units were ground down by combat. Defending the approaches to the DMZ was the South Vietnamese 3rd Division, a newly formed and relatively untested unit created only in late 1971. The division had established what commanders called a Ring of Steel, a network of fire bases with names like Camp Carroll, My Loc, and positions designated C1 and C2 just south of the DMZ. Two South Vietnamese Marine brigades, the 147th and 258th, were under the 3rd Division's operational control in the northwest sector, tasked with protecting approaches from Laos and the DMZ. The defensive system collapsed with shocking speed. On April 2nd, Camp Carroll was surrendered to the attackers. A white flag rose over the position as roughly 1,500 troops and 22 artillery pieces fell into enemy hands. The loss of Camp Carroll deprived the South Vietnamese of a major artillery base and allowed the attackers to turn the captured heavy guns southward against their former owners. Other fire bases fell in rapid succession during early April. Firebase Sarge and My Loc were abandoned as 3rd Division units withdrew toward Dong Ha and AI-2. The situation deteriorated so quickly that commanders struggled to establish coherent defensive lines. Dong Ha, a crucial road and bridge hub on the Aqua Viet Cam Lo axis, became the focal point of desperate fighting, as the enemy attempted to cross the rivers and cut South Vietnamese lines of communication. The South Vietnamese Marines of the 258th Brigade had deployed to Dong Ha on March 30th to support the 3rd Division in delaying the advance. But pressure mounted relentlessly. By April 2nd, the Marines were forced to withdraw from Firebase Sarge to My Loc Camp as positions north of Dong Ha became untenable. To slow the enemy armor, commanders ordered destruction of key bridges at Dong Ha and Cam Lo, though some structures were captured intact before they could be demolished. American naval gunfire and B-52 strikes targeted enemy forces massing north of the rivers during the first week of April. Navy aircraft from carriers offshore joined the effort as weather permitted. But the combination of monsoon conditions and the sheer weight of the enemy attack made it impossible to stop the advance. By mid-April, sustained pressure forced the South Vietnamese Marines to withdraw from Dong Ha entirely, leaving its defense to armored, ranger, and infantry units that struggled to hold the crumbling line. Throughout late April, the attackers systematically assaulted positions around AI-2 Combat Base, the main 3rd Division headquarters northwest of Quang Tri City. On April 29th and 30th, heavy attacks caused the defenses at AI-2 to crumble. General Vu Van Jai ordered withdrawal south of the Thach Han River. By April 30th, South Vietnamese forces had pulled back to a defensive line along the river's south bank, just north of Quang Tri City itself. The retreat grew increasingly confused. Communications breakdowns and conflicting orders from I Corps Commander Ingo Quang Truong and General Gi created chaos. President Tu issued directives stating that Quang Tri positions were to be held at all costs, prohibiting unauthorized withdrawals, but the pressure on local commanders was immense. Despite these orders, 3rd Division units continued to fall back, and discipline in some formations deteriorated under the relentless enemy assault. On May 1, 1972, Quang Tri City was abandoned. South Vietnamese forces withdrew southward through dust and chaos as enemy units entered the largely deserted provincial capital. It was the first provincial capital lost by South Vietnam since the dark days of 1968, a symbolic and strategic catastrophe that sent shockwaves through Saigon and Washington alike. The city that had stood as a bulwark against the North was gone. With Quang Tri in enemy hands, the main defensive line stabilized along the Mai Chan River between the Lost City and Hue. This new position, known as the Mai Chan Line, became the final barrier protecting Hue and the populated coastal regions of I Corps. Lieutenant General Ngo Quang Trong reorganized the defenses using Marine and Airborne divisions as key maneuver elements. These elite formations would have to hold where the regular infantry had failed. American air power played a decisive role in halting the advance toward Hue. Navy carrier aviation, Marine Air, Air Force tactical aircraft, and B-52 strategic bombers all concentrated their efforts over northern I Corps. As weather improved in May, sortie rates climbed dramatically, raining destruction on enemy forces attempting to push south. Sustained air attacks, combined with logistics strains and the heavy casualties already suffered, caused enemy operations south of Quang Tri to stall. The defense of the Mai Chan Line set the stage for what would come next. On June 13th, President Thieu authorized Operation Lam Son 72, a counteroffensive aimed at recapturing Quang Tri Province. Substantial forces were concentrated for the effort, including airborne and Marine divisions, along with several infantry regiments. Extensive American air and naval support would provide the firepower that ground units alone could not generate. The main ground phase of the counteroffensive launched on June 28, 1972. Known to American sources as the Second Battle of Quang Tri, it would become one of the longest continuous battles of the entire war, lasting until September 16th. The attack crossed the Mai Chan River with the Airborne Division on one flank and the Marine Division on the other, both formations advancing north toward the lost provincial capital. American Marine helicopter squadrons and Army aviation supported South Vietnamese heliborne assaults during the advance. The attackers moved through heavily defended terrain, often relying on artillery and airstrikes to reduce enemy positions before ground assaults went in. Progress was measured in hundreds of meters per day, each hard-won advance contested by defenders who had fortified their positions during the months since Quang Tri's capture. Quang Tri City itself, particularly its old walled citadel, became the focal point of intense fighting in July through September. Both sides concentrated elite units in and around the city. North Vietnamese 304th and 320B divisions faced South Vietnamese airborne and Marine brigades in bitter urban combat. On July 11th, heliborne assaults landed troops north and east of the city to cut enemy supply lines, tightening the noose around the defenders. South Vietnamese forces systematically closed remaining ground lines of communication, forcing enemy resupply across the Thac Han River under constant air attack. The city and its citadel were subjected to enormous volumes of air and artillery bombardment during the 81 days of battle. Block by block, building by building, the South Vietnamese fought their way forward. On the night of September 14th, the 3rd Marine Battalion of the 147th Brigade penetrated the southeastern corner of the Quang Tri Citadel's walls. By September 16th, South Vietnamese Marines had secured control of the citadel, and enemy forces withdrew to positions north of the Thach Han River. The provincial capital was back in South Vietnamese hands. The recapture of Quang Tri City on September 16, 1972, restored South Vietnamese control over territory lost 5 months earlier. The 138-day struggle for Quang Tri stands as the longest and bloodiest sustained battle of the entire Vietnam War. By year's end, South Vietnamese forces held the city and the area south of the Thach Han, while the enemy retained control of much of northern Quang Tri province, closer to the DMZ. American naval and marine histories conclude that air and naval gunfire support were critical in halting the enemy advance and enabling the counterattacks that recaptured the city. North Vietnamese sources characterize the capture of Quang Tri in April and retention of parts of the province after September as significant political and military gains. Both perspectives contain truth. The battle demonstrated that South Vietnamese forces could conduct large-scale offensive operations with strong air support, but the initial collapse had revealed vulnerabilities that would haunt Saigon in the years ahead. The question of whether these forces could survive without American air power remained unanswered, a shadow hanging over every assessment of what the future might hold. In the Central Highlands, the Easter Offensive sought nothing less than to cut South Vietnam in two. The objective was to seize Con Tum and Pleiku, the principal cities of the mountainous interior, thereby severing the narrow waist of the country and isolating the northern provinces from Saigon entirely. If the attackers succeeded, they would control the strategic crossroads, where roads from Laos met the main north-south highways, effectively splitting the nation along a line that ran from the Cambodian border to the South China Sea coast. It was an audacious plan, one that had been contemplated since the earliest days of the conflict, and now the forces were in place to make it reality. The Central Highlands Campaign was directed by the B3 Front under Lieutenant General Hon Min Tao. The forces assembled for this thrust included the 320th and 2nd Divisions operating around Con Tum, with the 3rd Division active in the coastal lowlands. In total, roughly 50,000 men were committed to the broader B3 area of operations, a formidable concentration that outnumbered the South Vietnamese defenders. South Vietnamese, the 2nd Corps, headquartered at Pleiku, bore responsibility for defending the Central Highlands. The principal maneuver units were the 22nd and 23rd Infantry Divisions, spread thin across vast stretches of jungle-covered mountains and plateaus. Serving as the senior American advisor to 2 Corps was John Paul Vann, a legendary figure whose influence on the defense of the Highlands would prove decisive. Vann had spent years in Vietnam and understood the terrain, the enemy, and the politics of the war as few others did. Intelligence in early 1972 had detected a substantial buildup in the tri-border area where Laos, Cambodia, and Vietnam meet. Based on these warnings, South Vietnamese forces deployed forward near Tan Kine and Dak Tu, establishing defensive positions intended to block enemy routes through the mountain passes. The 22nd Division commander, Colonel Leduc Dot, moved his forward command post, the 47th Regiment, and logistics elements into the Tan Can Dak Tu area before the offensive began. The high ridge line west and north of Con Tum, known as Rocket Ridge, contained multiple fire support bases used by South Vietnamese forces to observe and interdict enemy approaches. On April 4, 1972, the 320th Division opened attacks on these positions with heavy artillery and infantry assaults. Elements of the division briefly overran parts of Fire Support Base Delta, before being pushed back with the help of American Cobra gunships directed by Van himself. Over subsequent days, repeated attacks forced South Vietnamese units to fall back gradually from some fire bases toward the main defensive complex at Tan Khine and Dak 2-3. On April 12th, the main assault against the Tan Khine complex began. The 2nd Division, supported by elements of the 203rd Tank Regiment and independent regiments, attacked the base area with combined armor and infantry. When South Vietnamese armor from Ben Het moved toward Dak to reinforce, it was ambushed and destroyed by anti-armor teams along Route 512. The relief column never arrived. Days of heavy artillery bombardment wore down the defenders at Tan Khine, grinding away at morale and physical fortifications alike. On April 23rd and 24th, ground assaults breached the defenses, leading to the collapse of the 22nd Division's main forward positions. Soldiers who had held out for days under constant shelling found themselves overrun. On April 24th, Dak 2-2 was also overwhelmed, resulting in the loss of that base and the capture or dispersal of many 22nd Division troops. The division had effectively ceased to exist as a fighting force, its remnants scattered through the jungle. With the 22nd Division destroyed, 2 Corps Command ordered abandonment of other fire bases, and enemy forces moved down Route 14 toward Kontum. The situation appeared desperate. Pole Klang Special Forces Camp and Ben Het, which blocked approaches to Kontum and threatened enemy supply lines, came under intensified attack. Pole Klang sustained over 500 artillery rounds on May 6th alone before being evacuated. Ben Het was shelled and probed, though the enemy largely bypassed it as focus shifted to the provincial capital itself. The responsibility for defending Kontum City now fell to the 23rd Division under Colonel Lee Tong Ba. John Paul Van coordinated the defense with 2 Corps and increased the use of B-52 strikes against planned enemy approach routes, attempting to destroy attacking formations before they could reach the city. By early May, enemy main force units were positioned north and west of Kontum, preparing for a multi-regiment assault on the provincial capital. The main Battle of Kontum began on the morning of May 14, 1972, when enemy forces launched a large combined tank infantry attack against the city's northern defenses. Attacks on the 14th and 15th probed positions held by the 44th and 45th Regiments, while anti-aircraft units contested American and South Vietnamese air support. Helicopter gunships and fixed-wing aircraft provided close air support, targeting armor approaching the defensive lines. A new weapon entered the battlefield at Kontum, one that would change the calculus of armored warfare in the Highlands. American helicopter-mounted TOW anti-tank missile teams, codenamed Hawk's Claw, were deployed from Pleiku to engage enemy tanks near the city. The wire-guided missiles offered deadly accuracy against armor that had previously seemed unstoppable, striking from above where tank defenses were weakest. On May 21st, a major armored assault on Kontum's northern perimeter was repulsed after TOW-equipped helicopters and South Vietnamese infantry destroyed multiple T-54 tanks. The attack that had seemed certain to overwhelm the defenses was stopped in its tracks, burning hulks of armor littering the approaches to the city. B-52 strikes were employed extensively around Kontum, sometimes within just a few kilometers of the city. The strikes were coordinated so closely to friendly positions that South Vietnamese units had to withdraw to deep foxholes before bomb impacts, then emerge to engage any surviving attackers. The coordination was complex and dangerous, but it worked. During mid-May, the 44th Regiment maintained its defensive perimeter north of the city with support from AC-130 gunships, helicopter gunships, and artillery. In the main Kontum sector, the enemy committed the equivalent of at least 2 divisions and 4 independent regiments. Repeated probing attacks in late May were met by South Vietnamese counterfire and concentrated airstrikes that gradually reduced attacking units' strength. On May 27th, another large-scale assault involving tanks and infantry struck Contum's northern approaches. South Vietnamese soldiers used M72 Law anti-tank weapons and artillery, while air support again destroyed several tanks, halting the attack. Throughout late May and early June, pressure continued with artillery barrages and local infantry assaults, but no further large-scale offensive operations penetrated Contum's main defenses. The attacks had exhausted themselves against the combination of determined defenders, concentrated air power, and the new anti-tank weapons that stripped armor of its former advantage. Van and South Vietnamese commanders adjusted defensive lines, trading some outlying positions for a more compact, defensible perimeter around the city proper. The strategy was to concentrate strength where it could be most effective, rather than spread thin across exposed positions that could be overwhelmed piecemeal. By early June, intelligence concluded that enemy forces around Contum had suffered substantial losses and were unable to mount further major attacks on the city. The Battle of Contum is generally dated from May 14th to early June 1972, with most major assaults occurring in the second half of May. Despite the earlier catastrophic loss of Tan Khanh and Dak Tu, Contum City itself remained under South Vietnamese control throughout the Easter Offensive. The enemy did not capture Pleiku or succeed in severing the main north-south communications route through Tu Quoc. The strategic aim of dividing South Vietnam had failed completely, leaving Hanoi's planners to contemplate what might have been. Air power studies emphasized the critical role of B-52 and tactical airstrikes in destroying enemy units and compensating for South Vietnamese weaknesses in maneuver forces. The coordination among South Vietnamese infantry, American advisors, and air controllers in directing close air support under extraordinarily complex conditions proved decisive. After June 1972, enemy forces in the Central Highlands shifted to more limited operations, and the front stabilized with South Vietnamese forces holding Contum and key highland routes. North Vietnamese sources nonetheless claimed political and military gains from earlier successes at Tan Khanh and Dak Tu, which had demonstrated the ability to defeat South Vietnamese divisions in conventional combat. The defense of Contum, along with An Loc and the eventual recapture of Quang Tri City, became central examples of what South Vietnamese forces could accomplish with strong American air support. Whether they could survive without that support remained the question that hung over everything, a shadow that would darken the years ahead. As the Easter Offensive raged across South Vietnam's battlefields, the Nixon administration made a fateful decision to bring the war home to North Vietnam itself. Operation Linebacker. I would become the most intensive and sustained American air campaign against the North since the bombing halt of 1968, an effort designed to cut the lifelines that fed the communist offensive and force Hanoi's leadership back to the negotiating table. The gloves were coming off, and the full weight of American air power would be brought to bear in ways that had been unthinkable just months earlier. The campaign grew from earlier attacks codenamed Freedom Train, which had begun on April 5th with Air Force strikes north of the 20th parallel in direct response to the Easter Offensive. For the first time since the end of Rolling Thunder in 1968, American tactical aircraft were authorized to strike military targets in southern North Vietnam. The restraints that had bound American air power for nearly 4 years were being loosened. On April 10th, 12 B-52s supported by 53 tactical aircraft attacked petroleum storage facilities around Vinh, striking deep into enemy territory. By mid-April, almost all of North Vietnam had been cleared for bombing, removing many of the geographic restrictions that had frustrated military planners during Rolling Thunder. On April 16th, B-52s escorted by fighters and electronic warfare aircraft bombed fuel storage tanks at Haiphong, significantly reducing visible petroleum stocks at the country's main port. Naval aircraft soon joined the campaign, attacking tank farms and warehouse complexes near Hanoi itself. When these initial strikes failed to halt the Easter offensive, the Nixon administration decided to escalate further. On May 8th, Navy aircraft began Operation Pocket Money, laying mines in Haiphong Harbor's main shipping channels. On May 10th, the expanded aerial interdiction campaign was formally redesignated Operation Linebacker, covering strikes throughout North Vietnam. The name distinguished this campaign from its predecessor, Rolling Thunder, and signaled a new phase in America's air war. Linebacker I is commonly dated from May 9th and 10th, 1972 to October 23rd, when most bombing north of the 20th parallel ceased as negotiations advanced. The stated purpose was to interdict North Vietnamese lines of communication and supplies supporting the forces fighting in South Vietnam. Target categories included rail lines and railroad yards, bridges, ports and storage depots, power plants and airfields, and radar and communications sites. Everything that kept the war machine running was fair game. On the first full day of Linebacker, American Air Force and Navy flyers conducted 414 sorties against targets around Hanoi and Haiphong. Of those, 120 were flown by Air Force aircraft and 294 by Navy planes from carriers cruising off the coast. Initial strikes hit the Yen Vien railroad yards and the Paul Dumer Bridge near Hanoi, critical nodes in the rail network linking North Vietnam to China. The campaign marked a significant advance in the use of precision-guided munitions. Air Force aircraft employed both conventional unguided bombs and the revolutionary new laser-guided bombs to attack key bridges with unprecedented accuracy. On May 13th, American pilots using these precision weapons knocked down the Thon Hoa Bridge, known to the Vietnamese as Ham Rong, after years of unsuccessful attacks with conventional munitions that had cost numerous aircraft and lives. The bridge that had become a symbol of North Vietnamese resilience, surviving everything that Rolling Thunder had thrown at it, was finally destroyed by technology that changed the calculus of aerial warfare. During May and June 1972, B-52s, fighter bombers, and gunships flew approximately 18,000 sorties against North Vietnam, losing 29 aircraft in combat during that period. Over the entire campaign, Linebacker missions dropped approximately 155,000 tons of bombs in more than 41,000 sorties. The weight of ordnance was staggering, concentrated against a country's transportation and industrial infrastructure. Air Force reinforcement efforts, termed Constant Guard, deployed additional F-4 Phantoms and other aircraft to bases in Thailand during April and May to support the expanding campaign. Navy carrier presence off Vietnam peaked at 6 carriers during Linebacker, the largest concentration of carrier air power since World War II. Air wings from ships such as USS Coral Sea, USS Midway, and USS Saratoga participated heavily in the strikes, launching missions around the clock against targets that Rolling Thunder had never touched. For the first time in the war, the Navy was authorized to conduct large-scale aerial mining of North Vietnamese ports as a sustained campaign rather than a one-time operation. Linebacker operations required coordinated suppression of North Vietnamese air defenses, including the dense networks of SA-2 surface-to-air missiles, tracking radar, and anti-aircraft artillery that protected key targets. Wild Weasel F-105G aircraft and accompanying F-4s used anti-radiation missiles and cluster munitions in hunter-killer teams to neutralize SAM sites before the main strike packages arrived. North Vietnam responded with determination and ingenuity born of years of experience surviving American bombing. Supplies were dispersed across multiple locations, many shipments moved by truck at night when aircraft were less effective, and damaged rail lines and bridges were repaired with remarkable speed by work crews who had become experts at reconstruction under fire. North Vietnamese Air Force MiG-21s and MiG-17s engaged American aircraft in frequent air-to-air combat during Linebacker, defending their airspace with skill and courage. The first day of the campaign, May 10th, produced the heaviest single day of air-to-air combat of the entire Vietnam War, with dogfights swirling across the skies of the Red River Delta. American sources report that the Air Force experienced roughly a 1-to-1 kill ratio in air-to-air combat during the first 2 months, losing 7 aircraft in one 12-day period without corresponding North Vietnamese losses. Analysts attributed some early difficulties to outdated Fluid 4 formations, which were gradually revised as the campaign progressed and lessons were learned. Despite North Vietnamese resilience, Linebacker inflicted significant damage on the country's logistics system. North Vietnamese histories cited by American analysts state that between May and June 1972, only about 30% of planned supplies reached frontline units in the South. The pipeline that had fed the Easter offensive was being systematically dismantled. American estimates indicated that by September, imports into North Vietnam had fallen 35 to 50% compared with May levels. Rail traffic from China was repeatedly disrupted by strikes on bridges and yards on the Hanoi-Lang Sun Line, forcing supplies onto slower and more vulnerable alternative routes. Haiphong Harbor mining and bombing forced many seaborne supplies to be diverted to overland routes through China and Laos, dramatically increasing transport times and reducing overall capacity. Studies argue that while Linebacker did not completely stop supplies from reaching the South, it significantly reduced North Vietnam's ability to sustain the Easter offensive at the high intensity of its opening weeks. The combination of interdiction attacks against the North and close air support inside South Vietnam created a strangling effect on enemy operations that commanders in Saigon could feel on every front. Navy sources describe Linebacker as part of a broader sea-air campaign integrating mining operations, coastal surveillance, and strikes on inland logistics. Targets also included power plants and radio stations, aiming to degrade North Vietnam's electrical grid and command and control capabilities. B-52s flew roughly 1,000 sorties against North Vietnamese targets during the early Linebacker period, separate from their close air support missions in the South. American public statements framed the mining and bombing as responses to North Vietnam's massive invasion of the South, not as a resumption of unrestricted bombing for its own sake. By late summer 1972, Linebacker operations continued at a somewhat reduced tempo as enemy offensive operations inside South Vietnam diminished under the combined weight of ground defense and aerial assault. The Easter offensive had been blunted on all 3 fronts, and the bombing campaign was achieving its primary purpose. On October 23, 1972, most bombing north of the 20th parallel was halted as steps toward a ceasefire framework advanced in Paris. This effectively ended Linebacker 1, though the campaign's legacy would shape both the final agreement and the debates that followed for decades. Post-war American assessments generally conclude that Linebacker significantly degraded North Vietnam's logistical system, though debate continues over its precise impact on Hanoi's negotiating decisions and whether other factors played equal or greater roles. What is certain is that American air power had returned to the North with a fury not seen since 1968, and the message had been delivered with unmistakable force. The mining of Haiphong Harbor represented one of the boldest American military decisions of the entire Vietnam War. For years, military planners had advocated closing North Vietnam's ports to cut off the flow of Soviet and Chinese supplies. But political leaders had always rejected the idea, fearing it might provoke direct superpower confrontation or even trigger a wider conflict. The Easter Offensive changed that calculus forever. With North Vietnamese tanks rolling across the DMZ and American ground forces too reduced to mount an effective combat response, the Nixon administration finally authorized what Rolling Thunder had never dared to attempt. Nearly 85% of North Vietnam's import tonnage arrived by sea through Haiphong Harbor before the mining campaign began. Thousands of tons of weapons, ammunition, fuel, and equipment flowed through the port every month, sustaining the war effort in the South. Cutting that lifeline would force the enemy to rely on more limited and vulnerable overland routes from China, dramatically reducing their capacity to sustain offensive operations. Mining Haiphong had been considered at various points during the war, but repeatedly rejected over concerns about provoking Soviet or Chinese reactions. Soviet ships regularly called at the port, and the prospect of striking or sinking one had seemed too dangerous to risk. But by May 1972, with the Easter Offensive threatening to undo everything Vietnamization had attempted to build, the administration decided that the benefits outweighed the dangers. On May 4, 1972, Chairman of the Joint Chiefs Admiral Thomas Moorer ordered the Chief of Naval Operations to plan a harbor mining mission under the code name Pocket Money. President Nixon approved the decision within days as part of a combined strategy of mining and bombing to counter the offensive. On May 8th, Nixon announced the mining decision in a televised address to the nation, stating that mines were already being laid but would not arm for several days, giving foreign ships time to leave. Operation Pocket Money was executed on May 9, 1972, Vietnam time, when A-6 Intruders and A-7 Corsair the Sussex Coral Sea dropped the first mines in Haiphong's approaches. Carrier Air Wing 15 aboard Coral Sea had been designated to conduct this historic mission. The initial strike used 3 A-6 Intruders carrying 1,000-pound Mark 52 magnetic bottom mines for the inner channel and 6 A-7s carrying 500-pound Mark 36 destructor acoustic mines for the outer channel. Each aircraft carried 4 mines, resulting in 36 mines laid in Haiphong's ship channel on that first day. The mines were set with a 72-hour time delay fuse to allow foreign ships in Haiphong to depart before they became active. A second time fuse was designed to deactivate them after approximately 180 days, ensuring they would not pose a permanent hazard to navigation. At the moment of mining, approximately 37 foreign flagships were in Haiphong Harbor. 16 were Soviet, 5 Chinese, 5 Somalian, 4 British, 3 Polish, 2 Cuban, and 1 East German. Pentagon estimates indicated that 30 additional ships were en route to North Vietnam when the mining began. Additional mining missions over the next several days extended Pocket Money to other ports along the coast. Airdropped mines closed Thanh Hoa, Phuc Loy, Quang Cu, and Dong Hoi to the south of Haiphong, and Han Gai and Cam Pai to the north. The entire coastline was being sealed. By war's end, more than 8,000 mines had been dropped in North Vietnamese coastal waters, with another 3,000 laid in inland waterways. Navy records indicate that approximately 5,200 Mark 52 and Mark 36 mines were emplaced under pocket money specifically, with additional destructor mines dropped during linebacker flights. The total number of mines laid in North Vietnamese waters during the 1972 campaigns reached approximately 11,700. Pocket money mining missions were supported by electronic warfare aircraft such as EKA-3B Sky Warriors to jam North Vietnamese radar and protect the strike aircraft from surface-to-air missiles. The operation forced foreign ships in Haiphong either to depart during the grace period or remain in port for extended periods once the mines armed. 1 British and 4 Soviet ships managed to leave Haiphong before the mines became active. The remaining vessels were immobilized in port, unable to unload their cargoes or return home. Operation Pocket Money effectively closed Haiphong Harbor to deep draft shipping for approximately 300 days. The mines prevented routine dredging of the harbor's channels, leading to an estimated decrease in depth by about 2 feet as silt accumulated. Pentagon analysts in May 1972 expected that mining would have a gradual rather than immediate impact on North Vietnam's military operations. Defense officials anticipated that mining would be most effective when combined with bombing of railways and roads linking North Vietnam to China. Before the mining, Haiphong had received about 400 ships annually, bringing in roughly 4,000 tons of supplies per day. The harbor served as North Vietnam's primary link to the outside world, the gateway through which Soviet and Chinese military aid flowed into the country and onto the battlefields of the South. After the mines sealed the harbor, North Vietnam had to rely almost entirely on overland supply routes from China, using 2 main railway lines and 8 primary roads that were far more vulnerable to air attack and far more limited in capacity. Subsequent linebacker bombing repeatedly attacked these rail lines and bridges, compounding the effects of the mining by degrading the alternative routes as well and creating a comprehensive interdiction system. Historical analyses argue that the combined effect of mining and bombing significantly reduced North Vietnam's seaborne import capacity and complicated their entire logistics system. Navy planners believed the mine barrier had effectively stopped the flow of material into North Vietnam from the sea, forcing the enemy to completely restructure their supply operations. North Vietnam responded by increasing efforts to move supplies overland using trucks, smaller coastal craft that could navigate shallower waters, and internal waterways less affected by the deep water mines. The mining operations were closely coordinated with Operation Linebacker 1, forming a combined sea-air effort to cut North Vietnam's external supply lines from multiple directions simultaneously. Diplomatic commentary in 1972 highlighted Soviet and Chinese concerns about the mining, given the number of their ships trapped in Haiphong. The possibility of a superpower confrontation loomed over the operation from the beginning. Despite protests from Moscow and Beijing transmitted through diplomatic channels and in public statements, neither the Soviet Union nor China directly intervened militarily to challenge the American naval mining operations. The superpowers were unwilling to risk direct confrontation over North Vietnam's ports, despite their ideological commitments and economic investments in Hanoi's war effort. Analysts at the time suggested that the delayed arming feature of the mines helped reduce the risk of immediate confrontation, giving foreign vessels a window to escape and avoiding the spectacle of Soviet or Chinese ships striking American mines. The careful calibration of the operation reflected acute awareness of its potential to escalate into something far more dangerous than anyone wanted. American negotiators in Paris used the prospect of clearing the mines as a bargaining chip in discussions with North Vietnam. the offer to remove the mines became linked to North Vietnamese cooperation on ceasefire arrangements and release of American prisoners of war. It was a powerful bargaining lever, and Hanoi understood that reopening their ports depended on reaching an agreement that satisfied American demands. Operation End Sweep, the American mine-clearing effort in North Vietnamese waters, would take place between February and July of 1973 after the Paris Peace Accords were signed. Navy mine, countermeasures, helicopters, and specially equipped ships located and neutralized mines throughout Haiphong and other coastal areas in what became one of the most complex mine warfare operations in American naval history. The painstaking process of sweeping thousands of mines from harbors and channels required months of dangerous work. The mines that had sealed North Vietnam's ports for nearly a year were finally removed, opening the harbors to the commerce that would begin rebuilding a shattered country. Contemporary American assessments concluded that mining significantly constrained North Vietnam's access to seaborne supplies and increased their logistical dependence on more vulnerable land routes. Combined with the intensive bombing of Linebacker, the mining campaign represented a level of pressure that Hanoi had never experienced before. Whether it was decisive in bringing the war to an end, or merely one factor among many, remains debated. What is certain is that pocket money demonstrated American willingness to take risks that had seemed politically unthinkable just months earlier, and the world had watched to see what would happen next. While battles raged across Vietnam in 1972, another kind of struggle continued in the elegant conference rooms of Paris. The peace talks that had begun in 1968 entered their most intensive and ultimately decisive phase, as diplomats and negotiators sought an end to a war that had consumed American attention for more than a decade. 4 delegations sat across from each other, representing the United States, the Democratic Republic of Vietnam, the Republic of Vietnam, and the Provisional Revolutionary Government of South Vietnam. Their positions had seemed irreconcilable for years, but the events of 1972 would finally force movement toward a conclusion. The American official delegation included Ambassador William Porter and other diplomats, but the real negotiations happened in secret. Henry Kissinger, President Nixon's national security advisor, conducted parallel private talks that would prove decisive. On the North Vietnamese side, the formal delegation was headed by Xuan Thuy, but Politburo member Le Duc Tho served as special advisor and principal decision-maker in the secret sessions. These 2 men, Kissinger and Tho, would shape the agreement that eventually emerged. The South Vietnamese delegation represented President Nguyen Van Thuy's government, which consistently rejected any formula that implied its replacement by a coalition including the Communists. The Provisional Revolutionary Government delegation represented the National Liberation Front and sought recognition as a legitimate South Vietnamese political force on equal footing with Saigon. These 2 South Vietnamese parties viewed each other as mortal enemies, and any agreement would have to address their competing claims to legitimacy. The core issues had remained unchanged for years. Ceasefire arrangements, withdrawal of foreign forces, political structures in South Vietnam, and the release and exchange of prisoners of war stood at the center of every negotiating session. A major structural question was whether North Vietnamese troops would be required to leave South Vietnam after any agreement. Hanoi insisted they could remain, arguing that they were Vietnamese fighting on Vietnamese soil. Saigon demanded their withdrawal, viewing their presence as an occupation force. Another central dispute concerned the political future of South Vietnam itself. The North Vietnamese and the Provisional Revolutionary Government advocated a tripartite coalition or similar arrangement that would dilute Thieus' power and give the revolution a legitimate role in governing. The Republic of Vietnam insisted on preserving Thieus' presidency and rejected any suggestion that the communists should share power before an election they would almost certainly attempt to manipulate. On January 25, 1972, President Nixon gave a televised address revealing that secret talks had been underway and announcing a new 8-point American peace plan. The proposal called for withdrawal of all American and Allied troops and all communist forces from South Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos within 6 months of an agreement. It also called for simultaneous release of all military and civilian prisoners and an Indochina-wide ceasefire supervised by an international commission. Politically, the January plan envisioned presidential elections in South Vietnam supervised by a coalition of factions, with Thieu and Vice President Tran Van Huong resigning 1 month after the vote. Nixon stated that the United States was willing either to negotiate a comprehensive settlement including political issues or, alternatively, to settle only military matters and leave political questions to the Vietnamese themselves. It was a significant concession, but Hanoi publicly rejected the offer and maintained that any settlement must remove Thieu and ensure the Provisional Revolutionary Government's participation in governing the South. At the start of 1972, the secret talks between Kissinger and Thieu had reached a stalemate over these fundamental issues. The launching of the Easter Offensive at the end of March hardened positions on both sides while providing Hanoi with leverage it hoped to convert at the negotiating table. The offensive was meant not only to win territory, but to strengthen the communist hand in Paris. On May 8, 1972, Nixon announced that the United States would accept a ceasefire in place, allowing North Vietnamese troops to remain in South Vietnam while American forces withdrew. This represented a significant American concession from earlier insistence on mutual troop withdrawals. The announcement came alongside the decision to mine Haiphong and expand bombing under Linebacker, signaling that carrots and sticks would be applied together. After this concession and the beginning of military escalation, the talks resumed with a new basis for potential agreement. Progress in the negotiations increased in mid-1972 as battlefield momentum shifted and North Vietnam reassessed its position. The Easter Offensive had gained territory, but failed to achieve its decisive objectives. The combined effects of South Vietnamese resistance and American air power had blunted the attack. During secret sessions, Kissinger and Thieu discussed frameworks in which American forces would leave, a ceasefire would be declared, and South Vietnamese parties would negotiate internal political arrangements among themselves. A key North Vietnamese demand through mid-1972 was that the United States agree to remove Thieu as part of any settlement. Washington refused, citing South Vietnamese sovereignty and arguing that political outcomes should be determined by the Vietnamese themselves, though also pressed for American commitments on post-war reconstruction aid to North Vietnam, which Kissinger insisted should be considered a separate humanitarian matter not linked to the core agreement. By mid-1972, the American position combined an in-place ceasefire withdrawal of all remaining American forces, return of prisoners, and preservation of the Saigon government, pending later political negotiations conducted by the Vietnamese parties. The North Vietnamese position sought recognition of the Provisional Revolutionary Government, acceptance of their forces remaining in the South, and political arrangements that would reduce Thieu's dominance and open paths to eventual reunification. Following the partial failure of the Easter Offensive and the damage inflicted by Linebacker, Hanoi signaled more flexibility in late summer 1972. On October 8th, in a secret meeting in Paris, Leduc, though, significantly modified his position, accepting that the Saigon government could remain in place for the time being. He also agreed that the political future of South Vietnam would be worked out between the government of Vietnam and the Provisional Revolutionary Government rather than dictated in detail in the American North Vietnamese Agreement. Between October 8th and 17th, Kissinger and Tho produced a consolidated draft agreement covering ceasefire, troop withdrawals, prisoner release, and political principles. The October draft allowed North Vietnamese troops to remain in South Vietnam, but confirmed that the Saigon government would continue to exist alongside the revolutionary forces pending future political negotiations. The draft provided for release of all prisoners of war within 60 days of a ceasefire and withdrawal of all American and Allied troops within the same period. An international commission of control and supervision, including Canada, Hungary, Indonesia, and Poland, would monitor implementation. On October 26, 1972, Kissinger held a widely reported press conference in Washington, stating that peace was at hand and that an agreement was within sight. The Nixon administration believed the October draft could be finalized quickly, subject to consultation with Saigon. But President Thieu reacted with alarm. He objected strongly to clauses permitting North Vietnamese troops to remain and recognizing the Provisional Revolutionary Government as a political entity. Thieu argued that allowing enemy forces to stay would disadvantage his government in any future political contest and erode South Vietnamese sovereignty. American internal memoranda describe intensive efforts by Nixon and Kissinger to persuade Thieu to accept the October draft with limited revisions. Saigon requested numerous changes, including stronger language on withdrawal of foreign troops and more explicit limits on the revolutionary government's status and authority. Hanoi resisted large revisions, viewing the October draft as the product of a carefully balanced compromise that could not be reopened without unraveling everything. As disagreements over textual changes grew, Kissinger and Tho held additional sessions in November 1972, but failed to fully reconcile American, North Vietnamese, and South Vietnamese positions. By late November, mutual accusations of bad faith emerged, with each side claiming the other was backing away from October's understandings. The negotiating process that had seemed on the verge of breakthrough descended into acrimony and suspicion. By early December, the talks had stalled over unresolved points concerning the DMZ status, political language, and the sequencing of implementation steps. One specific point of contention was whether the demilitarized zone would be explicitly described as a provisional military demarcation line between two separate states or something less definitive. Peace, it seemed, remained tantalizingly close, yet frustratingly out of reach. The diplomatic impasse that had settled over Paris by mid-December demanded a response, and the Nixon administration chose to deliver that response from the skies above Hanoi and Haiphong. Operation Linebacker 2 began on the evening of December 18, 1972, launching what would become an 11-day strategic bombing campaign, conducted primarily by B-52 Stratofortress bombers against targets deep in North Vietnamese territory. The Joint Chiefs of Staff directed that operations continue until further notice, and the massive 8-engine aircraft began their long flights from bases thousands of miles away, converging on the enemy capital in waves that would continue night after night. The immediate trigger for this resumption of heavy bombing was the breakdown of negotiations after December 13th, when North Vietnamese representatives left the Paris talks without setting a date to return. Henry Kissinger, acting on consultations with President Nixon, sent an ultimatum on December 14th threatening grave consequences if Hanoi did not return to serious discussions within 72 hours. When no satisfactory response came, Nixon ordered what he termed a 3-day maximum effort of B-52 and tactical airstrikes concentrated in the Hanoi-Haiphong corridor, with the option to extend operations beyond the initial period if the enemy remained intransigent. Strategic Air Command planners designed Linebacker 2 as an intensive, centralized bomber offensive unlike anything seen since the massive raids over Germany and Japan in the Second World War. The primary targets included rail yards, rail lines, power plants, airfields, communication centers, and storage areas clustered around North Vietnam's two largest cities. This was not interdiction along distant jungle supply routes, but strikes at the very heart of the enemy's industrial and transportation infrastructure, delivered by the largest concentration of heavy bombers assembled since 1945. Air Force commanders understood they were being asked to accomplish in days what years of more limited bombing had failed to achieve. On that first night, 87 B-52s flew a total of 129 sorties against targets such as the Yen Vien rail yards, the Kin No Vehicle Repair Area, and various Hanoi railroad facilities. The bombers struck Kep, Hoa Lac, and Phuc Yen airfields as well, seeking to cripple North Vietnamese air and rail capacity simultaneously. The aircraft operated from 3 main bases spread across the Pacific: Andersen Air Force Base on Guam, Utapao Royal Thai Navy Airfield in Thailand, and some operations staged through Kadena in Okinawa. Tactical aircraft from 7th Air Force and Navy Task Force 77, including F-4 Phantoms and A-7 Corsairs, supported the heavy bombers with suppression of enemy air defenses and follow-on attacks against additional targets that the big bombers could not efficiently address. The first night's raids encountered heavy resistance from the start. SA-2 surface-to-air missiles rose from launch sites ringing Hanoi, their bright contrails visible against the dark sky as they sought the big bombers cruising at altitude. Anti-aircraft artillery of every caliber added to the barrage, creating a deadly environment for aircraft crews flying their carefully predetermined routes toward assigned targets. On the second night, December 19th, 93 B-52 sorties targeted the Kin No Rail Complex, the Tai Nguyen Thermal Power Plant, and the Yen Vien area once again. Remarkably, no bombers were lost on this second night, despite numerous missile launches and battle damage sustained by several aircraft returning to their distant bases. The third night brought 99 sorties against an expanded target list, including the AIMO warehouse complex, the Bac Giang transshipment point, a Hanoi petroleum storage area, and continuing strikes against the Tai Nguyen power plant and Yen Vien yards. But the early tactics employed by Strategic Air Command proved problematic in ways that became tragically apparent. The bombers used predictable ingress routes, altitudes, and formations, patterns that experienced North Vietnamese missile crews began to exploit with increasing effectiveness. In those first 3 nights, B-52s suffered significant losses to the enemy's integrated air defense system, prompting a scheduled pause and an urgent review of tactics at the highest levels of command. A 36-hour halt in bombing occurred from the evening of December 24th through December 25th for Christmas, providing crews a brief respite and planners time to reconsider their approach. Strategic Air Command used this pause productively, revising procedures to diversify approach headings, altitudes, and timing while improving electronic countermeasures designed to confuse enemy radar and missile guidance systems. When the bombers returned on December 26th, sometimes called the decisive night of the entire campaign, approximately 120 B-52s attacked Hanoi and Haiphong in 7 coordinated waves against 10 separate targets within a concentrated 15-minute bomb release window that saturated enemy defenses. Over the 11 days of Linebacker 2, B-52s flew between 729 and 795 sorties against targets throughout North Vietnam, the exact figures varying slightly among different accounting methods and sources. The bomber loss rate across the entire operation settled at roughly 2 to 2.5% per sortie, with 15 to 16 B-52s acknowledged as lost in combat and several more so heavily damaged they never flew again. In addition to the bomber losses, approximately 10 tactical aircraft were also lost during the campaign. Most B-52 losses were attributed to SA-2 missiles, with smaller numbers credited to MiG interceptions, anti-aircraft fire, or undetermined causes that would never be fully explained. By the last night of operations on December 29th, the tactical adjustments implemented after the Christmas pause had proven their worth. No B-52s were lost that final night, reflecting the cumulative improvements in approach procedures, timing, and electronic warfare capabilities that protected the bomber streams. The targets struck throughout the campaign included not only transportation infrastructure but also radio stations, storage depots, vehicle repair facilities, and command and control sites that coordinated North Vietnam's war effort. The Hanoi Thermal Power Plant, which had been designated off-limits during the earlier Linebacker I campaign due to its proximity to civilian areas, was attacked as a key piece of electrical infrastructure. Nixon ordered bombing north of the 20th parallel halted on December 30th after North Vietnam signaled its willingness to resume negotiations in good faith. On December 26th, even as the most intensive night of bombing was underway, Hanoi had transmitted a message indicating readiness to return to the Paris talks. Less than 2 weeks after Linebacker II ended, Kissinger and Leduc, though, resumed their patient discussions in Paris on January 8th and 9th, 1973, picking up where they had left off before the December breakdown. The agreement that emerged from those renewed talks closely resembled the draft that had been nearly completed back in October, with relatively minor textual changes despite American attempts at substantive revision during the difficult December negotiations. The final accord provided for an immediate ceasefire throughout Vietnam, the withdrawal of all remaining American forces within 60 days, and the release of American prisoners of war in exchange for communist prisoners held by Saigon. Air Force analyses concluded that Linebacker II achieved its limited but essential objectives of facilitating final American withdrawal and securing the return of prisoners who had languished in captivity for years. Official American narratives framed the bombing campaign as having compelled North Vietnam to accept terms it had earlier agreed to in principle, but had deliberately delayed implementing through prolonged negotiations. Some later analyses emphasized that the 11 December days demonstrated the ability of concentrated strategic air power to affect an adversary's negotiating calculus, breaking a diplomatic deadlock through the application of overwhelming force against carefully selected targets. North Vietnamese commentary and some foreign observers characterized Linebacker II quite differently, acknowledging the significant damage inflicted while arguing that it did not materially alter the basic political terms of the eventual agreement already sketched in October. International reactions to the bombing were widely and sharply critical. The Soviet Union issued strong protests through diplomatic channels. Some NATO allies expressed public concern about American methods, and segments of the American media questioned both the military necessity and the moral justification for such intensive attacks against a heavily populated area. Despite this chorus of criticism, the Nixon administration maintained that the operation had been necessary to end what it depicted as deliberate North Vietnamese stalling at Paris. Whatever interpretation one accepted regarding cause and effect, the 11 days of December had changed the trajectory of the negotiations, breaking the impasse that had frozen the talks and setting the stage for the agreement that would finally bring American troops home from Vietnam. The document that would end direct American military involvement in Vietnam bore the formal title Agreement on Ending the War and Restoring Peace in Vietnam, though history would remember it simply as the Paris Peace Accords. The agreement was signed in Paris on January 27, 1973, bringing to conclusion years of public negotiations, secret diplomacy, and battlefield carnage that had shaped the politics and torn the societies of multiple nations. The text contained 9 chapters and 23 articles outlining political, military, and implementation provisions that the signatories pledged to observe and faithfully enforce. 4 parties affixed their signatures to the accords, representing the complex political reality of a war that had never been simply between 2 opposing sides. The United States signed through Secretary of State William P. Rogers, representing the world's most powerful nation that had invested so much blood and treasure in the conflict. The Democratic Republic of Vietnam, the communist government in Hanoi, was represented by Foreign Minister Nguyen Duy Trinh. The Provisional Revolutionary Government of the Republic of South Vietnam, the political arm of the National Liberation Front that had waged guerrilla war for over a decade, was represented by Nguyen Thi Binh, who served as the PRG's Minister for Foreign Affairs. The Republic of Vietnam, the American-backed government in Saigon, signed through Foreign Minister Tran Van Lam, though his government had accepted the agreement only after considerable pressure from Washington and with deep reservations about provisions that seemed to favor Hanoi's ultimate objectives. The actual breakthrough had come days earlier. On January 23, 1973, Henry Kissinger and Le Duc Tho initialed the agreement in Paris on behalf of the United States and North Vietnam respectively, signifying that the 2 principal adversaries had finally reached understanding on the precise text after years of negotiations. That same day, President Nixon announced the initialing in a televised address to the American people, stating that a ceasefire would soon take effect and that peace was finally at hand after years of sacrifice, struggle, and agonizing debate over American policy in Southeast Asia. The military provisions of the accords were detailed and specific, reflecting hard-won compromises on points that had been contested for months and years. Article 2 specified that a ceasefire would be observed throughout South Vietnam beginning at midnight Greenwich Mean Time on January 27th, which translated to 8 o'clock in the morning on January 28th, local time in Saigon. At the same moment, the United States agreed to halt all military activities against the territory of North Vietnam, ending the bombing campaigns that had defined so much of the American war effort. Under Chapter 2 of the agreement, American and Allied forces were to remain in place after the ceasefire took effect, while a detailed withdrawal plan was implemented according to a strict timetable that permitted no exceptions or delays. The withdrawal provisions required that all American troops and other foreign forces allied with Saigon depart South Vietnam within 60 days of the ceasefire's entry into force. In parallel with these troop withdrawals, the parties agreed to complete the return of all captured military personnel within the same 60-day period. A separate protocol established specific procedures and schedules for exchanging lists of prisoners of war and conducting the actual handovers that would reunite prisoners with their homelands after years of captivity. The United States also committed to clear the mines it had previously laid in North Vietnamese waters, an obligation that would require extensive naval operations in the months following the agreement's implementation. Several articles addressed the broader political and territorial framework that was supposed to govern the peace and prevent renewed conflict. Article 4 stated that the United States respected the independence, sovereignty, unity, and territorial integrity of Vietnam as recognized by the 1954 Geneva Agreements that had ended French colonial rule. Article 5 stipulated that all countries must respect those earlier Geneva Accords and not impose any political tendency or personal regime on the South Vietnamese people. Article 6 prohibited the United States and all other foreign countries from continuing military involvement in South Vietnam, including the introduction of troops, advisors, and military personnel of any kind. The agreement banned the introduction of new war materiel into South Vietnam except on a replacement basis for equipment that had been destroyed, damaged, or worn out through normal use. The parties also agreed that foreign troops must be withdrawn from Laos and Cambodia, and that the 1962 Geneva Accords governing the neutrality of those countries should be respected. These provisions acknowledged the reality that the Vietnam conflict had long since spilled across international borders, engulfing all of former French Indochina in warfare that had devastated entire regions and displaced millions of people. The political future of South Vietnam occupied several key articles that represented some of the most contentious compromises in the entire document. Article 9 affirmed the South Vietnamese people's right to self-determination and stated that they would decide their own political future through genuinely free and democratic general elections conducted under international supervision. Article 10 called for the formation in South Vietnam of a National Council of National Reconciliation and Concord, a body composed of 3 segments: representatives of the Saigon government, representatives of the PRG, and a neutralist third element drawn from other political factions. The council was carefully defined as an institution to promote implementation of democratic liberties and organize elections, rather than as a governmental structure that would exercise executive authority over daily affairs. Article 11 emphasized that the internal affairs of South Vietnam would be settled by the South Vietnamese parties themselves without foreign interference from any external source. The agreement explicitly recognized the demilitarized zone at the 17th parallel as a provisional military demarcation line rather than a permanent political boundary between 2 separate states. Both North and South Vietnam pledged to pursue reunification step by step through peaceful means without coercion, annexation, or foreign interference. This careful language attempted to balance Northern insistence on eventual national unity with Southern resistance to immediate political absorption by the communist government in Hanoi. Implementation mechanisms were specified in considerable detail. The 4-party Joint Military Commission, comprising representatives of the United States, North Vietnam, South Vietnam, and the PRG, was established to supervise the ceasefire, troop withdrawals, prisoner returns, and mine removal operations. Article 18 called for an international commission of control and supervision consisting of representatives from Canada, Hungary, Indonesia, and Poland. This international body was mandated to supervise compliance with the ceasefire provisions and investigate alleged violations reported by any party. The commission was designed to operate on the principle of unanimity, meaning all 4 member states had to agree on findings and decisions before any formal action could be taken. A separate international conference on Vietnam convened in Paris from late February to early March 1973, establishing reporting mechanisms and rules of conduct for the Supervisory Commission. Under the Accords, the United States also undertook to contribute to healing the wounds of war and to post-war reconstruction in North Vietnam, explicitly stating that such assistance would be provided without any political conditions attached. This commitment to reconstruction aid had been a significant element in the final negotiations, though its implementation would ultimately fall victim to the political aftermath of the war and congressional reluctance to fund assistance to a former enemy. President Thieu of South Vietnam had agreed to the accords only after receiving American assurances, including promises of continued military and economic aid and possible retaliatory action if North Vietnam violated the agreement's provisions. These private assurances helped overcome Saigon's profound objections to terms that permitted North Vietnamese forces to remain in place within South Vietnamese territory while American forces withdrew entirely. The American departure began almost immediately after the agreement took effect, with the last combat troops leaving South Vietnam on March 29, 1973. Operation Homecoming, the program to repatriate American prisoners of war, proceeded in parallel with the troop withdrawals. The first large group of American POWs was released by North Vietnam on February 12, 1973, in accordance with the implementation protocols. By late March, the principal initial implementation steps had been formally carried out. The ceasefire had been declared, American troops had withdrawn, major prisoner exchanges had been completed, and international supervisory teams had deployed throughout South Vietnam. Whether this carefully constructed framework would hold, and whether genuine peace would follow the ending of direct American involvement, remained questions that only time and events would answer. The promises written into the Paris Peace Accords now had to be kept, and for the United States that meant bringing home both its soldiers and its prisoners of war. Article 8 of the agreement required all belligerents to repatriate prisoners of war within 60 days of the ceasefire taking effect. The ceasefire began at midnight Greenwich Mean Time on January 27, 1973, starting the clock on a timetable that would bring closure to some of the most painful aspects of American involvement in the war. For families who had waited years without knowing whether their loved ones were alive or dead, the next 2 months would bring either the profound joy of reunion or the final confirmation of loss that some had dreaded receiving throughout the long years of uncertainty and desperate hope. The American program to bring its prisoners home bore the code name Operation Homecoming, a simple and evocative name for an effort that represented the end of captivity for men who had endured years of imprisonment under harsh and often brutal conditions in enemy hands. The operation began on February 12, 1973, with the first release of American prisoners from North Vietnam. That day marked the beginning of an emotional procession that would continue for weeks as aircraft carried freed prisoners from Hanoi across the Pacific Ocean to freedom and the embrace of waiting families who had never stopped believing their men would someday come home to them. The first flight of returning prisoners departed Hanoi's Gia Lam Airport on February 12, 1973, aboard a C-141A transport aircraft that would later earn the affectionate nickname the Hanoi Taxi for its role in these historic and deeply emotional missions. The big military cargo plane carried men who had been shot down over North Vietnam years earlier, some of whom had spent the better part of a decade in captivity waiting for this moment of release and redemption. From February 12th through April 4th, 1973, 54 C-141 missions flew out of Hanoi to transport released American prisoners of war, each flight bringing more men back to their country, their communities, and their families who had never stopped hoping and praying for their safe return during years of painful separation. Air Force records documented that Operation Homecoming returned 591 American prisoners of war in total over the course of the operation. Of these 591 returnees, 566 were United States military personnel and 25 were civilians who had been captured under various circumstances during the long and complex conflict that had engulfed all of Indochina. The service breakdown among the military prisoners reflected the nature of the air war that had brought so many of them into enemy hands. 325 were Air Force personnel, 138 were Navy, 77 were Army, and 26 were Marines. Army historical records specifically note that 76 of the returning prisoners were soldiers who had served in various capacities throughout the theater of operations spanning multiple countries. Some of the prisoners counted among the 591 had been held in Laos or South Vietnam rather than in the north, but all were released through North Vietnam as part of the coordinated process established by the Accords and its implementing protocols. Early release groups during Operation Homecoming were generally organized by length of captivity, with those who had been held longest often among the first to depart for home. This humane approach brought home first the men who had suffered the most extended periods of imprisonment, some dating back to the mid-1960s when American involvement in the air war over North Vietnam first escalated dramatically and the first pilots began falling into enemy hands after being shot down over hostile territory. Separate prisoner exchanges took place in South Vietnam itself, where prisoners of war held by the PRG and Viet Cong forces were turned over at designated exchange sites such as Loc Ninh near the Cambodian border. These southern exchanges proceeded according to protocols carefully worked out between the military commissions established by the peace agreement to supervise implementation. 9 foreign nationals other than Americans were also released under the prisoner provisions during the homecoming timeframe, reflecting the international dimensions of a conflict that had drawn participants, advisors, and casualties from multiple nations beyond the primary belligerents who had signed the Paris Accords. American prisoners were first flown to Clark Air Base in the Philippines, where they underwent initial medical examinations and extensive debriefings before continuing their journey home to American soil. The stop at Clark provided essential medical screening for men whose health had often deteriorated during years of inadequate food, limited medical care, and in some cases deliberate mistreatment and torture by their captors. From Clark, the returning prisoners flew to bases such as Travis Air Force Base in California and other reception points throughout the continental United States, where families and appreciative crowds gathered to welcome them home with flags, banners, heartfelt embraces, and tears of relief that the long waiting was finally over. The National Museum of the United States Air Force notes that Operation Homecoming flights continued into early April 1973, concluding the scheduled prisoner repatriation specified in the Paris Agreement. President Nixon publicly stated after Operation Homecoming that all known American prisoners of war had been accounted for, though American lists still contained thousands of personnel classified as missing in action, whose fates remained undetermined despite extensive efforts to locate and identify them. The painful distinction between prisoners who had been confirmed alive and successfully returned and those whose status remained unknown would haunt American policy and American families for decades to come, creating an ongoing national obligation to determine the fate of every missing service member regardless of how much time had passed. Central Intelligence Agency documentation indicates that secret pre-1973 understandings had linked prisoner release schedules to American troop withdrawal timetables, creating a framework where each side's concessions would be matched by reciprocal actions from the other. In parallel with the prisoner releases, American troop withdrawals proceeded under the 60-day deadline established in the Accords. At the time the Paris Peace Accords were signed, approximately 24,000 to 27,000 American military personnel remained in South Vietnam, a fraction of the peak strength that had exceeded 500,000 just a few years earlier during the height of American ground combat involvement. Vietnamization had already accomplished most of the withdrawal before the peace agreement was signed. But these final troops represented the last direct American military presence in the country where so many had served, sacrificed, and died over the preceding decade of escalating involvement. The last American combat troops left South Vietnam on March 29, 1973, ending direct United States ground combat involvement in a war that had consumed American attention, resources, and national unity for more than a decade of increasingly bitter domestic debate. On that same day, Military Assistance Command Vietnam, the headquarters that had directed American military operations throughout the war years, was formally disbanded and its flags lowered for the final time in a somber ceremony marking the end of an era. In its place, the United States established a much smaller defense attaché office in Saigon, which would coordinate whatever military assistance continued to flow to South Vietnam under the new post-agreement arrangements designed to support the Thieu government. After March 29, 1973, fewer than 250 American uniformed personnel remained in South Vietnam, assigned primarily to the Defense Attaché Office and security duties protecting the American Embassy compound in Saigon. About 8,500 American civilians working for the United States government stayed in the country after the military withdrawal, continuing various assistance and advisory functions in a civilian capacity that no longer carried direct combat responsibilities. The four-party Joint Military Commission completed its supervisory work and held its final meeting on March 28, 1973, certifying that the withdrawal and exchange provisions had been fulfilled. Contemporary records confirm that by late March 1973, American forces had withdrawn in accordance with the Paris timetable, while all Vietnamese forces remained in place throughout the country. This fundamental asymmetry was central to the agreement's structure and would shape everything that followed. North Vietnamese troops who had infiltrated into South Vietnam over the years were permitted to stay where they were, while every American soldier had to leave. The implications of this arrangement for the future balance of power on the ground would become tragically apparent in the months and years that followed, as the war between Vietnamese forces continued without American combat participation. The men who came home under Operation Homecoming had survived their ordeal, but the conflict they left behind was far from over. By late 1973, the formal ceasefire provisions written into the January Paris Peace Accords remained in force on paper, but they were widely reported as violated by all Vietnamese parties to the conflict. The ink had barely dried on the agreement before the fighting resumed in forms both large and small throughout South Vietnam. The International Commission of Control and Supervision reported as early as March 1973 that the ceasefire had not been effective, citing numerous violations by South Vietnam, North Vietnam, and the PRG. The peace that the world had celebrated in January proved to be largely illusory, a pause in direct American involvement rather than an end to the war itself. The dangers facing those charged with monitoring the ceasefire became tragically apparent in April 1973 when an ICCS helicopter was shot down near Route 9 in Quang Tri Province, killing 9 international observers who had been attempting to investigate reported violations. This incident underscored the hazardous conditions that persisted despite the formal truce. Central Intelligence Agency reporting on communist violations documented continued infiltration of North Vietnamese personnel into South Vietnam and Laos after a second ceasefire appeal issued on June 15, 1973. Agency estimates indicated that more than 13,000 North Vietnamese personnel entered the infiltration pipeline between mid-June and late 1973, suggesting that Hanoi had no intention of allowing its forces in the south to wither through natural attrition. American reporting on communist violations documented attacks, shellings, and movement of troops and materiel south of the DMZ and across borders in clear contravention of the Accord's provisions. South Vietnamese sources similarly accused PAVN and Viet Cong forces of thousands of ceasefire violations aimed at expanding communist control in rural districts where government authority had always been tenuous. Scholarly assessments describe 1973 and 1974 as a period of ceasefire war, with continued low to medium intensity fighting throughout the country despite the formal truce that was supposed to have ended hostilities. The human cost of this ongoing warfare remained substantial. Army University Press studies note that South Vietnamese armed forces suffered approximately 26,500 killed in action during 1973, illustrating that combat continued at significant intensity despite the American withdrawal. North Vietnamese and PRG forces continued to hold large swaths of the countryside and border areas, while Saigon retained control over most major cities and provincial capitals. The Army study titled Vietnam from Ceasefire to Capitulation describes many districts throughout the country as contested territory, with control shifting or shared between ARVN and communist forces depending on the season, the terrain, and the local balance of military strength. In the northern region of I Corps, North Vietnamese units remained in position in northern Quang Tri Province and along the approaches to the demilitarized zone throughout 1973. In II Corps, the Central Highlands, PAVN forces north and west of Kontum continued to pressure ARVN positions at places such as Trung Nha during the middle months of the year. The Battle of Trung Nha from June through September 1973 saw North Vietnamese forces temporarily seize terrain near Kontum before ARVN counterattacks managed to retake key positions. In III and IV Corps, communist units maintained bases in border areas and the Mekong Delta, mounting operations such as the Battle of Hong Yu In, early 1973, that demonstrated their continued offensive capability. South Vietnamese military strength remained substantial on paper. ARVN force levels stayed close to 1 million personnel across all branches, including the regular Army, territorial forces, Air Force, and Navy. Army historical accounts note that ARVN divisions maintained their pre-Accord organizational structure, but losses through combat and desertion, combined with budget constraints, increasingly affected operational readiness. The territorial forces, the regional and popular forces that provided local security in thousands of hamlets throughout the country, continued to bear much of the burden for defending rural areas against communist pressure and infiltration. Communist forces in the South still comprised multiple PAVN divisions and local Viet Cong units, though precise strength figures for late 1973 varied among different intelligence sources and analytical methods. CIA infiltration reporting and captured documents indicated that North Vietnam was replenishing units in the South and in Laos during 1973, though at somewhat lower levels than during the massive buildup that had preceded the 1972 Easter Offensive. The war had not ended. It had merely changed character with the departure of American combat power. External support continued to flow to both Vietnamese sides from their respective superpower patrons. A SIA memorandum estimated that Soviet military aid to North Vietnam in 1973 fell to approximately $150 million, less than half the level provided during the critical year of 1972. The same analysis noted that China and the Soviet Union together provided about $385 million in economic aid to North Vietnam during 1973, including food, fuel, and reconstruction goods needed to repair damage from American bombing. Soviet military deliveries reportedly included some SA-3 surface-to-air missile components and new radar systems, though no major new offensive weapons systems that would have dramatically altered the military balance. On the American side, research summaries indicate that after the March 1973 withdrawal, the United States provided South Vietnam approximately $2.6 billion in aid through the end of that year. This post-withdrawal American support consisted mainly of military assistance, economic aid, and continued reconnaissance flights over Vietnam until mid-August 1973, when congressional action imposed new restrictions. That congressional action established August 15, 1973, as the cutoff date for American bombing anywhere in Indochina and severely restricted future military operations in the region, regardless of what North Vietnam might do. Defense Department histories note that South Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos all struggled to maintain force levels and operational readiness after American air and ground support ended. The South Vietnamese government under President Thieu continued to rely on American financial and material aid to sustain ARVN operations and basic state functions. Economically, South Vietnam faced mounting inflation, persistent budget deficits, and dangerous dependence on American assistance that showed no signs of becoming self-sustaining. Army and Defense Department studies highlight that fuel, ammunition, and spare parts costs increased significantly during 1973, straining South Vietnam's logistics budget and forcing difficult choices about which units could be adequately supplied. Politically, Thieu remained in power with a strong presidency, but opposition figures and international observers increasingly criticized the concentration of authority and persistent corruption that undermined the government's legitimacy and effectiveness. The National Council of National Reconciliation and Concord envisioned in the Paris Accords as a mechanism for political dialogue between Saigon and the PRG existed largely on paper by late 1973, with limited practical influence over events on the ground. North Vietnamese leadership portrayed the Accords domestically as a political and diplomatic success, while continuing to refer to South Vietnam's government as a puppet regime in official discourse. American reconnaissance missions continued along North Vietnam's periphery throughout 1973, monitoring compliance and military movements as Washington tried to maintain awareness of communist intentions. Despite the June 13th joint communiqué by the United States and North Vietnam calling on all parties to respect the January ceasefire from June 15th onward, effectively reiterating truce commitments, CIA reporting confirmed that communist infiltration after that date continued unabated. The International Commission's contributing nations, including Canada and later its replacement Iran, faced persistent difficulties investigating violations due to security risks, limited enforcement powers, and the fundamental requirement for unanimity that paralyzed decision-making when the communist and non-communist members disagreed. By the end of 1973, contemporary analyses generally described South Vietnam as still holding major population centers but facing continued PAVN and Viet Cong pressure, constrained resources, and an uncertain external support environment that grew more precarious with each congressional vote in Washington. The war had shifted to a contest of will and resources between a Saigon government dependent on American support and a Hanoi government backed by Soviet and Chinese assistance. The Paris Peace Accords had removed American troops from the battlefield, but they had not brought peace to Vietnam. The question that hung over the region as 1973 drew to a close was whether the balance of forces that existed when the Americans departed could be maintained, or whether the withdrawal of direct American military support had fundamentally altered the strategic equation in ways that would only become apparent when North Vietnam chose to test the new reality. The answer would come soon enough, but for now, the war continued in its grinding way, consuming lives on both sides of a conflict that had no end.